This is the Night Watch, painted by Rembrandt in 1642. It's one of the central foci of Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum, celebrated for its colossal size, its dramatic use of chiaroscuro raised to the level of tenebrism, the contrapuntal dynamism of its many details, and its exquisite formal balance. All of the things I just said about this painting, other than details of authorship and current disposition, could with equal justification be said of Gustav Mahler's Seventh Symphony, the inspiration for which came partly from the composer's viewing of this very painting. It's on account of that fact that the Seventh Symphony has accrued the unfortunate nickname Song of the Night, an appellation that Mahler may never even have heard, and of which he almost certainly would not have approved. To be sure, many of the particulars of this symphony suggest the nocturnal, including, most obviously, two movements entitled Nachtmusik. But it's not just about the dark half of the diurnal-nocturnal cycle. For instance, the trajectory of the symphony's 5 movements could just as well be described as a journey from night to day. And even if we read it that way, it's important to keep in mind that this symphony is about far more than that. It's both a great nature painting and the portrait of a psyche responding to both the natural and built worlds. This symphony is autobiographical, for when did Mahler ever write anything that isn't? As Arnold Schoenberg famously declared, of all composers who ever lived, Gustav Mahler succeeded best at expressing himself. But in order to express himself, Mahler had, of course, to give expression to the world in which that self lives and moves and has its being. And the world, as Mahler himself famously quipped to Sibelius, contains everything, and the symphony must be like that. This one certainly is. That's one of the reasons I found it so off-putting for so many decades. If one is going to try to understand the whole world, one had better take it in bite-sized portions and approach it systematically. And this pair of videos is the result of my finally having done that with this symphony. I want to tell you a little about that process of discovery, in fact, but in the relating of it, I'm going to need to start with a few words about how this symphony came to be in the first place. That story has everything to do with the approach that I took to understanding a composition whose meaning had eluded me. Mahler began work on this symphony while he was completing the Sixth. He had begun the Sixth in 1903 and brought it to performance the following year, releasing his final version after some controversial revisions that I talked about in my videos covering that symphony in 1906. By that time, the Seventh was substantially complete, although Mahler wouldn't take it into performance for another 2 years, by which time some of the Sixth Symphony's hammer blows had fallen on his own head. I wonder how he managed to conduct the finale of this symphony under those circumstances. If you don't know what I mean by that, I think you'll be able to piece it together by the time we're done here. In order of composition, the 2 Nachtmusik movements, one in C major minor, yes, both, alternating between those modalities so freely that it's impossible to commit to one or the other, and the other in F major. The next to be written was the Scherzo that lies between the 2 Nachtmusiken. Those 3 movements then turned out to be the core of the symphony and were thus taken together, considered by the composer to be part 2 of a large 3-part symphony. What remained to be written after that first summer, then, were the flanking movements, 1 and 5. Hold that thought in mind while I digress, meaningfully, I hope. Keep in mind that Mahler was not a full-time composer. He made his living as a conductor and manager, so only his summers were free for composing, and he tended to pour everything he had into the limited compositional time available to him. With the Fifth Symphony, written in the summers of 1901 and 02, he had embarked on a new path. Prior to that time, all of his symphonies had either included song or made such direct reference to it that song must be considered one of its major topics, and there I'm talking about the purely instrumental first. With the fifth, Mahler set aside the expressive potential of the human voice and contented himself with the symphony orchestra and its many-hued but semantically less articulate voices. The fifth took the form of a large three-part work, pairs of movements understood as compound units flanking a central scherzo movement. Thus, movements 1 and 2 of Symphony 5 comprise part 1 of that symphony, the large central scherzo, part 2, and then the famous adagietto and the rondo finale that it introduces, part 3. There is also a tonal journey made here. This symphony exhibits progressive tonality, the ending of a work in a different key from the one it started in. That tonal journey is one that in this case goes from darkness to light, from a gloomy C-sharp minor opening funeral march to a brilliant D major rondo finale. A half-step rise from a minor key to the next available major one. Hold as many of those details as you can in your mind while I talk now a little bit about the Sixth Symphony. The Sixth is also a purely instrumental work, but very unlike the Fifth. Here, the tonal center is fixed. What begins in A minor also finishes there. Here, the movements are in the traditional classical arrangement of 4 in number, and they hew closely to venerable formal models, sonata form, scherzo and trio, ABA. The musical ideas are among Mahler's most avant-garde, yet they are constrained in their unfolding by the secure formal frameworks hallowed by tradition. The Sixth Symphony's motto, its seal, is a simple but horrifying harmonic gesture, the decaying of an A major triad into a minor triad on the same key note. It is used to vivid, memorable effect throughout the Sixth, and it will recur in the Seventh. There are novel instruments used in the Sixth, and some of them will also find their way into the Seventh. Cowbells, for instance, and deep bells and switches for whipping the shell of the bass drum. The Seventh, like its two predecessors, relies on purely instrumental forces. In its final shape, it's a bit like an inversion of the Fifth. It's also an arch-form symphony that exhibits progressive tonality running from darkness to light, B minor to C major in this case, but the arch is organized so that two very large standalone movements flank a central part that's made up of 3 movements, also arch-like in their configuration, 2 Nachtmusiken flanking a central scherzo. Its final movement, like that of the Fifth, is also a rondo finale. It is on account of these shared features, in addition to a few others, some references to the Third Symphony, for instance, that some critics panned the Seventh, claiming to have found evidence in it that Mahler had run out of ideas and was beginning to repeat himself. Well, of course he was repeating himself. My God, every day of one's life is, in some sense, a repeat of those that have gone before, and there are always enduring formative features of our days taken together that find expression in every individual day. So what's the problem? Sure, that major-minor seal occurs in the Sixth Symphony and recurs in the Seventh, but it doesn't mean the same thing in the context of the Seventh that it meant in the Sixth. The Seventh is a new day. The Seventh, unlike the Sixth, is not a tragic symphony. If you followed me through all that, you've got a fair idea already of what you can expect from Mahler's Seventh Symphony, even if you're not familiar with it, or have, as I had until a month ago, only a passing acquaintance with it. But I'll review here because I think a synopsis is useful, and also because the analysis you see in Part 2 is constructed in such a way as to reflect both the story of the symphony's birth and the story of my growing acquaintance with it. An acquaintance that just deepened and deepened until there was no denying the fact that I had fallen in love with a symphony that I had ignored for decades. That is where I am now, and one of the many reasons that I'm glad that I lived to see this day, and glad that I can share with you a few of the discoveries that I made along the way. The first movement is a gargantuan thing with a large introductory expository chapter set in B minor. The shape of the movement is thus quite similar to that of the Sixth Symphony's final movement, and here, as there, the opening expository chapter will return at the recapitulation for further consideration and comment. The opening of the movement is dark and set in a rhythm that was suggested to the composer by the sound of oars on a lake, a sound that Mahler claimed to have reawakened his muse after a year of drought. That rowing accompaniment carries a strange, off-center, Dorian-flavored solo for the tenor horn, a distinctive voice orchestral novelty. This penetrating, brassy-sounding wind voice will be heard at important junctures throughout this opening movement. The short exposition sets forth two themes in the highest contrast, a difference so great that it might be reckoned chiaroscuro. The two thematic regions, one a grim march and the other a love song, connected by the most inebriated-sounding transitional music you can ever hope to hear. As Mahler said, the symphony must be like the world. It must contain everything. The development section of the opening movement is almost 4 times as long as the exposition and includes a slow, quiet central section that may remind you of something similar in the Sixth Symphony. Its greatest climax is achieved by a gorgeous, large-scale unfolding that is simply indescribable. And its build-up is to... If you're acquainted with the same composer's Ninth Symphony, you're probably thinking about the same spots in the final movement that I'm thinking of. I don't think I'll say anything further about the opening movement other than to mention the fact that this is the last time Mahler would use sonata form as his architectural default. And I think that's at least a little bit significant. The music is certainly capable of speaking for itself, and I've commented liberally on it anyway in the course of my analysis. The first night music is a generously proportioned rondo form movement whose mood is established at the outset by 2 lonely hornists calling to each other as across a great distance at night. Little by little, the sound of night birds and scampering critters are painted into the musical canvas, and the main theme then comes singingly forth in rich mid-range voices alternating easily between C major and C minor. There are 3 themes in this movement, all set in near-related keys, all of them bewitching. And speaking of bewitching, that little punctuating collegno figure, that rhythm, rat-tat-tat-tat-tat, straight out of Mahler's song Reveille, you'll find it everywhere here. This is a lovable movement, nocturnal for sure, but those woods don't seem threatening in the least to an old hillbilly from Red Lick Mountain who spent a lot of time in those woods at night. It's an experience often laced with mystery, but not menace. The movement ends strangely in a curiously disembodied way, perhaps prefiguring the Scherzo. A long skein of birdsong near the end certainly adumbrates a passage from the Ninth Symphony's first movement. Mahler had different ways of writing about his experience, however similar his experiences might have been in isolation from context. The Scherzo movement is certainly the nadir of the symphony. Here the night is darkest and not so friendly, occasionally alarming when witches jump out from behind trees. Much of it is like a waltz, yet not a waltz, rather a caricature of a waltz, a wry comment on it, or a horrific parody. The movement does nevertheless manage, if just barely, to finish in D major. So the way back out to the light could be said to have begun by that time. And that way opens up in earnest in the second Nachtmusik, some of the most pleasant F major music you can ever hope to hear, inaugurated by the concertmaster in a sweet, simple introductory phrase, which is the same idea greatly expanded and played forte on the G string by all the violins in the orchestra that opens the final movement of the same composer's Ninth Symphony. This movement also incorporates novel instruments, the guitar and mandolin, and reduces the orchestra otherwise by almost half, eliminating the noisiest forces altogether. It is this music's fragile chamber music quality that first won my heart as I was trying to make sense of this elusive symphony. Every time I hear it, I'm cheered and happy. How can it be that a piece of music can make someone happy? Isn't that just amazing? Then there's the finale. This is the movement that seems to cause the most listeners the most difficulty, and I can certainly understand why. There's no question that the movement is somewhat parodic. That over-the-top celebratory main theme is clearly some kind of comment on Die Meistersinger, and the juxtapositions of bright and dark in the closest proximity, the radical shifts in meter and tempo and swings of mood, this can be an exhausting trip unless you're determined from the outset just to fasten your seatbelt, mutter your prayers, trust the composer who's driving this bus, and go on the tour with him. If you can approach it that way, I believe that even if you don't quite have the words for it by the time you're done, as I clearly don't, even after a month of talking to myself about this music, you'll understand why Mahler had to do it this way, even if your understanding is wordless. In the recording, you'll hear the Chicago Symphony Orchestra is led by Claudio Abbado. Mahler is an awfully rich diet, especially following 2 straight months of non-stop consumption of his 6th and 7th symphonies. My soul needs a break. I might need to treat 1 or 2 of Bach's cello suites before tackling the Symphony of 1000.